Hello and welcome to a discussion and a walkthrough of the works in our upcoming exhibition South Asian Modern Art 2020. The exhibition takes place at the Gallery in London from the 23rd of July to the 14th of August, and everything is on view. All the works will be at the gallery. Do please get in touch by email to arrange an appointment to come and view them. That's art@grosvenorgallery.com. We had intended for this to be a slightly bigger event, and as the gallery is 60 years old this year, so 2020 marks 60 years of the gallery. Its first exhibition was held in October 1960, and you can see here a few of the early catalogues. The top two are actually, for the design geeks out there, the top two were designed by British designer Jock Kinnear, who, with Margaret Calvert, designed the British road signs that you still see in use today. He designed these very early Grosvenor catalogues, and then of course Grosvenor started working with Souza. So these are again two early catalogues from the first one on the left, The Human and Divine Predicament. That was a show in 1964, and then the catalogue on the right is Souza Black Art and Other Paintings, which are the black on black works, and then other works and works on paper by Souza. What's quite interesting about the catalogues on the right is that it's the same as the cover, and the image at the top, the grey squares, are actually that material that you find on scratch cards that you can scratch away with a point. That below that grey material is actually this image of Souza surrounded by two women in full-on bondage gear. I mean, it's not everyone would have known that. To do, if you scratch that off, that image appears, but I included that because I thought that was quite an interesting one, which people may not have seen before. One of our recent ventures has been a podcast, which we started a few months back. We've had a few episodes so far, and that's essentially talking to artists we work with and collectors and curators, and just discussing their work. And We've recorded 3. The next one features Olivia Fraser, and that'll be coming out next week. That's available on Apple Podcasts and Google and all that sort of thing. So do go on there and subscribe and have a listen. Right, so we're beginning this catalogue with the earliest work. We're going in sort of chronological order. This is a very lovely painting by Lakshman Pai from 1949, which depicts the procession of the relics of Saint Xavier in Goa. So this was painted in 1949, and you can see in the top of the field a sort of, there you go, that's a better one, a man lying on a sort of being displayed and processed through the streets to the church, and this procession still takes place today. Once every 10 years his relics are removed from the church and processed through the streets. It's a very auspicious occasion, and what's really lovely about this is the sort of natural tones used, the blue and the coral pink. I mean, it's a very Goan scene in its nature, that you've got the sort of terracotta tiled roof of the church, which is synonymous with that area, and then the Christian iconography sort of flowing through the work. What I particularly like are the little sprouting flowers that you can see. It's sort of almost like a sort of tapestry or a fabric. But this work was probably brought to Europe by Lakshman Pai when he moved to Paris in the late 1940s, as it ended up in a flea market in Paris, Clignancourt. How it got there, no idea, but it's a survivor from that early period of his work. And this is the famous photo of Padamsee, Souza, Raza and Pai in, I think, Padamsee's hotel room, surrounded by their works of art. And that was taken, I think, in 1951. So we have a number of interesting early works from the 40s and 50s. This one by Haider from 1954, and it's titled on the back "Workers," and this is egg temper on board. And what I particularly like about this is the colouring and the graphic nature of the composition. You've got the women standing in front of the sort of white blocky building, and their face and their legs and their neck are the same colour as the trees in the background. I think it's a very harmonious picture. And this comes from a collector in the States, and it was originally acquired in Hawaii from the East-West Centre, which was opened in 1960. What's quite interesting about that place is that a lot of the buildings there were designed by I.M. Pei, so there's some amazing architecture on that campus. But again, this has been in a collection in the States for many, many years. Another work from the 1950s is this really very delicate and subtle painting by Bendre titled Young Birds, painted in 1958. And it's something that, the subject doesn't automatically leap out at you, but once you see it, it's really a very sensitive depiction of two young birds in the nest, sort of against this haze of brown paint. And this was originally acquired from Kumar Gallery in New Delhi and found its way to a collection in the south of France, where it remained until fairly recently. So again, this is something that has emerged after many, many years in private possession. And again, there you go. What's quite nice about this is there's this lovely moss green that's lining the nest. It's really a very lovely thing, and very subtle. Another work from the 1950s is this painting by Ali Imam, a Pakistani artist, the brother of Raza, of course, who is credited with sort of being one of the artists who introduced modernism to Pakistan in with regards to his work running Indus Gallery. So he not only sort of mentored and nurtured these young artists, he also created a gallery which supported them a great deal, in addition to being an important artist himself. And this painting is untitled but depicts a deserted town, and on the left you can see this black sun, an image that a lot of artists were working with at the time. The sun, traditionally a symbol of sort of creation and destruction in Indian culture. This blacked out sun is something you see a few artists using at the time. This to me sort of almost looks like a stage set, the way that the houses and the buildings are all laid out. And this was in a private collection and acquired directly from the artist. I'm just going to show you a couple of comparable images of other artists using this concept of the black sun. You've got Raza's two works from the early 1950s on the left, and then Souza on the right, Landscape with Black Planet. And then, of course, Raza's Black Sun develops into the Bindu later on in his career. But I'll just read you a little bit of text about Ali Imam's work from this period, which comes from Jalal Uddin Ahmad's writing in the late 1950s. He says, in his recent work, he has been concentrating on the theme of houses, in which architectural qualities have replaced the earlier emphasis on colour. The sense of perspective is conspicuous by its complete absence, and the first impression on seeing an exclusive exhibition of these empty front elevations, as a critic put it, while reviewing his exhibition 2 years ago, is one of haunting loneliness, which is, I think, very applicable to this work. So we'll move on, and move on to a collection of 3 paintings by Jamini Roy from the collection of John Scott Everton, who was principally the United States ambassador to Burma in the early 1960s. He had a number of other positions out there and went out there after the Second World War as well, but he had these in his possession for many, many years, and then they were passed through his family, and we acquired them recently in the US. So here you've got this classic dancing girl, and then we move on to this work called Pujarin. So it's the classic image of woman holding an offering. And then what's quite interesting about this one is on the back there is a unfinished study for another painting, which is quite interesting. And then we move on to the third work that was in his collection, this lovely dancing Ganesh, which I think is just a really, really wonderful image. We actually have this in the window of the gallery at the moment, and we have had a lot of people sort of pop their heads in and ask about it. And I thought I'd just show you a few comparable images. Of course, Jamini Roy draws on the influence of Kalighat paintings, 19th century Kalighat paintings in his work. And this is just to sort of give you a visual reference to the imagery that he was basing his paintings on. And you'll see bottom left, that's the reverse of the painting in our show, which has another sort of very fine little ink study for Ganesh's head, which I think is rather charming. We move on to works by Souza now. This is a rather fine watercolour and ink on paper. Something that's quite interesting about this is that it comes from the collection of Nicholas Guppy from Cambridgeshire. On the back of the board, it says Guppy. So it's quite an uncommon word, that. So we can only assume that it comes from this source, which is and he was known for having acquired works by Souza. And actually, I found in the old gallery records, I found a note card saying that Nicholas Guppy had bought 6 works on paper by Souza in the sort of mid-1960s. So whether this was one of them or not, we're not sure. We can't say, but there is a possibility that this was bought from Grosvenor Gallery in the mid-1960s. We then move on to a really interesting painting. It's called A Head of a Man with Glasses, and I thought I'd just read to you a quick excerpt from a letter that Souza wrote to Victor Musgrave in November 1958 from Barcelona. He says, "Dear Victor, I'm leaving for Palma tomorrow evening after spending about a week here. I like Barcelona though, and I hope to return frequently. I managed to do one painting last night. It is a head of a man with glasses. It is painted on canvas. I think I'll paint mainly on canvas from now, although it is 5 or 10 times more expensive than hardboard. I will have to leave the painting I did in the hotel, but I am seeing to it that it is not lost." And indeed, it was not lost. It was brought back to the UK and acquired by a doctor and his wife in the late 1950s, and has been in the family collection since then. It not only appears referenced in that letter from Souza to Victor Musgrave, Souza also writes a very lovely letter to the original owner inviting him to his show at Gallery 1 in 1961 and remarking that it'll be a very busy evening, so do try and come in and see the works beforehand. The original collector had a collection of African sculpture as well, and Souza asks, how is man with glasses fitting in with your collection of African sculpture, which is quite interesting. I just think this is a really arresting image. You've got the sort of almost, the top half is almost referencing that sort of the suited gentleman, the respectability, the glasses, those figures that he was painting in the mid to late 1950s. And then you have this amazing tunic that the figure's wearing, which covers almost the bottom half of the canvas, with the swirls and the flashes of colour, which references Catholic saints and Catholic imagery. I just think it's a very striking picture, which in the flesh really does hold your gaze. It's a very interesting thing. We have copies of both of those letters at the gallery as well, so we can share that information with anyone that is interested in this work. This is a lovely little drawing of Souza's dealer, the man who ran Gallery 1, Victor Musgrave. He was one of the leading dealers in London in the 1950s and 60s, and was really quite a pioneer, exhibiting some artists in London for the first time, including Yves Klein and Rufino Tamayo, and was described by David Sylvester as a true pioneer. He was also the first dealer to show the work of Bridget Riley. Gallery 1 supported a number of eminent artists from South Asia, including Avinash Chandra, Shemza, Taib Mehta, but he is ultimately known for his role in promoting the work of Souza. This, I should say, originally comes from the collection of Victor Musgrave. We move on to a couple of really lovely Souza landscapes from the mid-1960s. This work depicts Belsize Park in London, and I will just read to you the catalogue note that Connor wrote for these two works. The 1960s for Souza marks a very different chapter to the one that he had experienced in the 1950s, when he was a recently arrived immigrant artist trying to establish himself in the London art scene. By 1960, he had had a string of sellout shows. He could afford to buy nice suits and was more likely to be seen at the Royal Academy than in the drinking dens of Soho. A hardbound monograph was published by Anthony Blond in 1961, the essay written by a leading critic of the time, Edwin Mullins. He was no longer living in digs or shared accommodation and had bought a large white stucco terraced house in Belsize Park. These two paintings are done in this period and in fact depict Belsize Park and Hampstead, which are old villages now incorporated into London and sit on and around Hampstead Park overlooking the city. Stylistically, they are classic 1960 modernist works, painted in thick oil with black outlines, marking out the rooftops and spires. These works were highly desirable and commercial, and Souza would have probably painted them in his studio and indeed sold them from his studio to his local affluent neighbours who would come and visit this now well-known figure. These are really lovely oils. This is titled on the back Belsize Park, London, and was painted in 1964. And then the second work is this lovely Red Buildings in London, again titled on the back, and comes from a collection in the UK. Slightly later on, you're into the mid-70s now with this work, Volvox Head, titled on the back and signed. It depicts a monochrome blue and white image, which Souza did a couple of these paintings with Volvox in the title. You know, they're looking at sort of cell clusters and things like that. This work was originally exhibited at Saffron Art, a show that we did with Saffron Art in New York in 2008, and is published in that catalogue. This is sort of 7 or 8 years after he'd finished his association with Grosvenor Gallery and moved to the US. This picture really does pack quite a punch, actually. The white is extremely bright, the blue's lovely and thick, and it presents really, really very well indeed. This is a work by Sadequain, Sadequain, painted in Paris in the early to mid 1960s. It's not dated, so we can't be absolutely sure, but this is a really lovely little jewel of a painting in sort of reds and blues, and with that typical cross-hatched scratching technique that he used throughout his career. And this was in the collection of Gallery Presburg, who had exhibitions of Sadequain's work in the 60s, and then was in the collection of a man called Forge for many, many years, and then we acquired it in Paris a few years ago. This was shown in our exhibition in Dubai, Calligraphic Abstraction in the École de Paris. And I've just shown you a couple of comparable images. Sadequain worked with this sort of stylistic setup a few different times. You know, he used this theme of the figure wrapped around and in on itself a number of times, in different colorways and with different levels of impasto. This one here, the only one that's from these references that is actually scratched away and into the canvas. We also have a collection of works by Chughtai, of etchings by Chughtai, which come from various sources in the States and in Europe. The one on the right, titled To Earth, I actually haven't seen another example of this before, so this is quite a rare one. We've had one other edition of Dupatta before, but the work with the flower and in the pot is really rather lovely. Again, a few more works by the artist, To the Pilgrimage and Young Boy, both from private UK collections, and then the last work called Jealous, which came from a private collection in the States. We also had these sort of quite interesting advertising posters, which were created to publicise his book Chughtai's Indian Paintings, which was published in 1951. They have these coloured plates, and are just quite good fun, really. We've actually put one up in the bathroom at the gallery, and it gets quite a few comments. Lancelot Ribeiro, who was, of course, an artist from Bombay and Souza's half-brother. These are, we have a few works from the 1960s onwards. Christ displaying his wounds is particularly striking, and the background's really lovely. It's almost like a sort of a rug or a tapestry. And then you have this very, again, figure outlined with thick black paint, you know, very typical of the work of that period. And these works come from the estate of the artist. And then Landscape with Moon and Tree on the right is just a very lovely, typical landscape by the artist from that period. This was shown in the exhibition we did with Saffron Art and Sunaparanta in 2014 and was exhibited in New Delhi. And then we have an unexhibited work as well in the show. This is just a collection of ephemera that was part of the exhibition that happened at Newark Museum and Art Galleries in Leicester a couple of years ago, a museum show featuring the work of Ribeiro. So this is his, you know, you can see images of him and Souza and from his life in the UK. And this is another installation shot of that exhibition. And we have a large-scale painting in the show called The Offering, which is clearly inspired by his Catholic upbringing in Goa. Ribeiro was born in Goa and moved to Mumbai when he was a young boy with his brother and his mother. and you can see that sort of clearly Catholic religious iconography depicted here, but incorporating the use of PVA in his painting style meant that you have these sort of almost sort of like an acid-inspired, dripping, psychedelic use of colour. And this is a large picture. This is sort of nearly 2 meters high, so it's really quite a commanding thing. This is a very lovely work by Maqbool Fida Husain from 1967. This comes from a private collection in the US, and 1967 was an important year for the artist because it was the year he won the Golden Bear Award for the best short film at the Berlin Film Festival for his work Through the Eyes of a Painter. And you can see that's on YouTube, so that's definitely worth a watch. It's a really interesting thing, and you can see some of the iconography and images used in that film can be sort of seen in this work. The man and the woman, the Rajasthani figures that have made their way into this work. And there's this lovely quote from Shiv Kapoor in his monograph on the artist. Like Picasso, Husain has been deeply isolated in his personal life. In response to his inner necessity, his paintings of the late 60s, early 70s more than ever appear to fracture the metaphor of sex into a tension of opposites, an affair of shadowy alienation that finds darkness at the heart of Genesis. And you can see that. You've got here the line bisecting the canvas on the X and Y axis. You've got the figure to the left, the woman on the left, the man on the right. It's sort of that trade-off of, man, woman, human, divine, and the sacred from the profane. It's a conversation that Husain has in his work of this time, really quite clearly writ on the work. Again, this is a large canvas and is really in lovely condition and presents extremely well. Moving on to this very lovely work by Raza, L'Orage, which means the storm. And I think when you're aware of the title, it really does add to the effect the work has on you. It's a very dark, dramatic picture with sudden flashes of white and yellow and red, like a storm. You've got the lightning, almost the white cutting through the darkness and the gloom. And it's a really very striking picture. This was exhibited at Gallery Coloriton in their exhibition Indian Painters in 1976. It's been published and it will feature in a forthcoming edition of the Raza catalogue Raisonné. It was painted in 1973, which is a key period in Raza's career. It's the time when he starts researching India and its heritage and incorporating that into his work, moving away from the École de Paris and moving into this period where he's much more heavily influenced directly by his memories and then translating that onto the canvas. Raza comments on this period: I needed 10 years in Bombay and I needed 30 years in Paris to understand what is plastic art, what the fundamental requirements of a vital painting work were so that it could be called important. Raza said, I did this in France, in Paris, and I am grateful that I could come to a certain recognition in the art world in France and the rest of the world, but I was still unhappy. I said to myself, yes, it is all right to be an important painter of the École de Paris, but where is your Indian background, Raza? I asked myself, and I started coming more and more regularly to India for 2 and 3 months every year to study again what Indian culture was, what Indian sculpture was. I went to Ellora and Ajanta, I went to Benares, I went to Gujarat and Rajasthan. I looked at the sculptures and paintings, I read books, and I still needed another 20 years to arrive where I am today. It is not very easy to give 50 years of one's life to the fundamental research of painting. It was a long period, a long wait, but I did it. This is a very lovely work on paper by Arpita Singh, which actually sits, I think, extremely well next to the Raza in terms of the aesthetic. This is from 1974, and it clearly shows the effect of Arpita's time at the Weavers Service Centre in the 1960s, where she studied various Indian cloth-making traditions and fabric construction techniques. Of her work at the time, Arpita Singh says, I began to understand pattern, and soon textiles became a passion, which has influenced the manner in which I construct and colour my images. And I think you can clearly see the references to textile making and manufacture in this work. This is another work by Peter from 1987, which is titled Woman Watching an Aeroplane and the Cats Playing. This is a sort of typical work from that period, full of character, full of humour, full of detail, and just a really lovely, interesting, characterful work. And then we move on to some works from the 1980s. The piece on the left by Ismail Gulji, which depicts two camels. This is a very large work on paper, which comes from a private collection in the States. And then the oil on the right by Seneca Senanayake from around 1985 of a forest scene with deer jumping and women reclining in the background, this sort of ethereal scene in blues and reds and greens. A really rich and very, very lovely picture. We also have a few works by Dhruva Mistry, small cutout steel works, and then a reclining figure in red. These are classic works that you would come to expect by the artist, and again present extremely well. So that really concludes our run through of the exhibition. As I say, if you'd like any images of works in situ on display at the gallery, do please contact us, art@grosvenorgallery.com, and if you have any questions, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.